Hey everybody, this is Bishop John Selders, and welcome to another episode of what we call Relevant Conversations, where we sit down and have a talk about it. We, as the young people say, we chop it up a little bit with some of my friends and interesting people who are engaged in all kinds of things that have at its core or the intersection of what I call faith and morality and religion, how we do our justice work, as many of you know, is framed in this context that speaks from our faith, speaks from our center place. And so I have had recently the opportunity to meet this fabulous woman who has actually, I've gotten a little smitten by her. I love a great mind, and somebody who can deal with prose and who can write a good sentence. Boy, we're going to be friends if you can write just a little bit. And so I have the distinct pleasure of introducing to you Katherine Stewart, an author and a journalist covering religion and politics and policy. Brought her latest book, and we're going to talk a little bit about this book right here. This book right here, I've been telling all my friends, you need this book in your library. You need to get this book. You need to get this book. It is called The Power Worshippers. It's the inside word around the dangerous rise of religious nationalism. And it has won first place in the Religion News Association's Excellence in Nonfiction books category. Katherine has published stories and articles for the Good News, has published a book called The Good News Club, a book that talks about the religious right and its effort to infiltrate and undermine public education. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And her articles have appeared in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the New Republic. Listen, I told you she's a writer. She can write. She can write. And I had the pleasure to moderate a conversation that Katherine was invited to participate in. And I hit her up later and said, can we talk some more? Because I find, first of all, this stuff fascinating, and two, have some connection to it, which we're going to talk a little bit about as well. Let me introduce to you, Katherine. Come on into the room. Hey there.
Hi, it's so great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. It's really such a pleasure to be in conversation with you today.
This has been great. We've been having some interesting conversations in preparation for us doing this. And you all tell me, you gonna like, if you like what you hear about this, we can have some more of these kinds of conversations. I believe the more we know about what's happening, and maybe what I would call the more nefarious context that is happening out here in these religion streets. The better informed we are, the better we will in fact be as we engage and navigate through these religion streets, if you will, as they occupy space in popular culture, and as they occupy political space, which is vastly important. Which leads me to my awakening, if you will, my coming to know that there is something going on that's beyond what I have further understood. 1979, I was at home for some reason, some odd reason, and I happened to be watching, which I was prone to do, television. I'm a product of 1960s and 70s, and I love the Brady Bunch, Beverly Hillbillies, a little Leave It to Beaver, but not too much of Leave It to Beaver. I'm a product of the TV watching, sitcom related television shows. And so, of course, I was flicking the channels. We didn't have clickers at that time. You had to get up and go over to the television and turn the dial. And of course, during that period of time in my hometown, Christian television used to occupy some of the daytime watching television time. And so here was Pat Robinson, 1979, in a conversation on his premiere flagship television show, The 700 Club, that was developed by Jim and Tammy Baker, by the way. I'll get back to that later. All right, get back to that later. They wanted a Tonight Show, Johnny Carson style Christian show. And so they pitched it to create this show and did, in fact, the 700 Club did, in fact, do what they wanted it to do. It to be newsy, but also informational, but not preachy, but kind of preachy. Y'all get what I'm saying right there. And so here's Pat Robinson doing a special where he is outlining how he believed that they would take over this country, school board by school board. That we needed a new reformation or develop a new way to think about how we participate as Christians into the public stream. And they wanted to do it kind of suggesting we're not going to be too political, although it was all the way political, but do it by building out school board by school board across this country. And I thought, 10 years later, the Christian Coalition, which Pat Robinson was early on a leader, Jerry Falwell's, if y'all remember, Moral Majority, y'all remember them? And these kinds of organizations, and later Ralph Reed took on the Moral Majority leadership. So within the space of about 10, 12 years leading the effort into what happened in the 90s and the wholesale takeover of Congress, Newt Gingrich, and the contract on America. And I heard about how they were going to do this from 1979, that period of time from 1979 to 1994, when the contract on America came in with Newt Gingrich and the others. Man, I all of a sudden understood that something had happened that I didn't quite pay attention to, but now we were faced with the reality that a new political force had come on the scene and was gaining momentum, but more importantly, was now taking positions of power and beginning to dictate public policy in a way that here before then had not paid that much attention to. So that was my beginning to understand that there was something happening that was being led by religious, I'm going to call them extremists, but I wouldn't have understood them to be that at that point. Katherine, how am I doing?
You're doing great. And it's so interesting that you mentioned 1979, because that's the year that Jerry Falwell said, I hope to see the day when there are no more public schools, churches will have taken them over and Christians will be running them. And, the opposition to public education runs deep in the DNA of the religious right. Today, we can see a lot of those dramas playing out with some of this sort of insanity, sort of small explosions of hate taking over public school boards across the country over what they mischaracterize as CRT, but it goes much deeper. You know, the religious right would like to promote the myth that they came together around opposition to abortion, but the movement actually came together. The sort of most modern iteration of the movement came together, I would say, in the mid 1970s, mid to late 1970s, some years after the passage of Roe versus Wade. Around, there were a lot of issues that they were concerned about. They were very concerned about, people like, I'm thinking about people like Paul Weyrich, Phyllis Schlafly, Alan Dye, Howard Phillips. They were very concerned about the civil gains of the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, issues like that. They felt the Republican Party had gone too soft on communism. But the thing that really got them up in the morning, the thing that really upset them, was the idea that segregated schools, segregated religious schools, racially segregated religious schools, might have their tax privileges taken away from them. People like Bob Jones, who was running a segregated school, he called it, he actually he was a big defender of segregation. He actually had a sermon called "Is Segregation Scriptural?" and concluded that segregation was God's established order. And there were a number of other very prominent preachers at the time who were running these segregation academies, and they didn't want to lose their, the IRS was kind of looking at them askance and saying, why are we offering tax privileges to these schools that are practicing segregation? But they thought this was, the idea that their tax advantages should be revoked was terrifying to them. So they were but they knew, like, stop the tax on segregation wasn't really going to be an effective rallying cry for their movement. So they kind of went down a laundry list of issues that they thought might unite their new movement. They needed to bring in conservative Protestants, conservative Catholics, which were really important to their movement as well. And I think it was Howard Phillips who said, some of our fundamentalist friends. I mean, even then they saw some of this sort of fundamentalism as a little beyond the pale, but they knew they needed those folks as well. And it was like when they got to the issue of abortion, it was like a light bulb went off and they were like, that could work. And so over time, they actually purged pro-choice voices from the Republican Party. At that time, most Protestant Republicans supported some form of abortion rights and liberalization of abortion law. But it was really the threat of losing their their tax advantaged status for these segregated academies that brought it together. But the whole thing about the hostility to public education is very interesting, and it's really a key to the movement, not only to their, I think it touches a lot of things. Number one, they're afraid there's a movement that rejects the principles of pluralism and equality that represent the best of the American promise. So public schools teach kids how to get along with others, including those who are different. They expose kids to, other kids from different families. And that's something that I think is very potentially threatening to the movement. They also see the attack on public education as really essential for the long-term funding of their movement. They want to get, the government spends, many billions of dollars on public K through 12, and they really want to get their hands on a portion of that and divert it to religious schools and have those be taxpayer funded, no matter how sectarian their teachings or bigoted their offerings, whether they teach, contempt for people who are different or not. So that's a big part of the religious rights sort of attack on public schools.
So you mean to tell me, Katherine, that the frame of abortion and of course sexuality, we'll frame that in a minute. These kinds of litmus tests that are used by these folk who want to tout that the Bible says, quote, whatever that means to them. Really, their interest was not, God speaking against gays and pro-life, that they were really interested in segregation in schools.
It was all of it. It was all of it. They were interested in all of it. They were very, this is a movement that's always been preoccupied with gender order. It's a movement that's always been preoccupied with the idea of hierarchies, rooted in the Bible, always of men over women, historically of white people over Black people. And I think for a lot of the white people in the movement, their racism continues to play an incredibly vital role, even though they might sort of just try to disguise that. I think a lot of the sort of CRT stuff that we're seeing in public schools today is race baiting. And if you look at the way they're using the idea of CRT, which is not taught in public schools, as you know, to sort of lump everything that they don't like, they call anything they don't like CRT, any discussion. I mean, they're banning books by people like Toni Morrison. I mean, it's unbelievable, and any teachings about America's history of slavery, segregation, the consequences of that, racial redlining, all of this, they're trying to sort of ban this kind of aspect of our history and de-educate children in this way. But yes, they had a number of concerns. Gender order is certainly one of them. I think, various economic concerns. But, here's the funny thing. I think of these, like a lot of these culture war issues as, a lot of people think about the religious right as like a culture war, preoccupied with same-sex marriage and, women's access to reproductive rights and so on. But that's just part of it. I mean, this is a leadership-driven movement. It's not driven by the rank and file, and the issues are really framed and put forth by the leadership. And I could sort of run through that a little bit at a later point. But when they're talking to the rank and file, when they're talking to pastors about the issues that they should talk to their congregations about, it's all abortion all the time, defense of what they see of the traditional family, et cetera. But when they're in the forums that they share amongst themselves, when they're talking to their political allies, it's not just about these culture war issues. A lot of it is about economic policy, broad-based social policy, foreign policy. So what they've essentially done is they're exploiting these culture war issues in order to pursue their many agendas, a very broad-based anti-democratic agenda.
Sure. This is fascinating to me. One, that's the trajectory that we have in what we now are experiencing in these latest culture war conversations, right? But what's also fascinating to me is I lived through these years, right? So I remember the importance of Christian television. Mm-hmm. Yes. So you had TBN and right, its rise. But even before that, you had PTL. That's Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, and then you got the Trinity Broadcasting Network out in on the West Coast. These entities got developed in the 70s, right? To in fact proliferate these kind of conversations. These conversations. This was the precursor to what we now have as cable news networks, right? So Fox News and other said, I would say, extremists to one side. And let me just say, there are extremes of all kinds here. But I'm speaking of this kind of extremist with sprinkled with religion, that then baits you into a conversation about not what's right and wrong, but actually centers on power and building power, political power specifically, aided by those who are not advocating what I would call the principles of the gospel, feeding the poor, helping the needy, the homeless, those who are in prison. No, it's actually gaining its power vis-a-vis saying we need to protect these few folk and these really, really very narrow understandings of what the teachings of Jesus, if we're talking about Christianity, but I want to open it up to a broader understanding of what our faith traditions also teach about what is actually at the core what we ought to be about if we're going to be faithful people. It's not about building power. In fact, if you take a look at the Jesus story, it's all about toppling power. It's all about getting in the face of empire and flipping empire on its head. I find it fascinating that these organizations and these teachers would center on the abortion and sexuality. And let's be clear, we're talking about same gender loving and all of that comes along with that. They would center on those two things because they understood it and they worked on it. They would gather in groups. Katherine, could you talk a little bit about how they organized themselves and how they met over time? That this wasn't just somebody had an idea and then jumped off and took off and went viral. No, they worked on this. They seeded this. This has its beginning in some of Ethlie Bailey's work and some of the work that came out. Barry Goldwater in the 1960s, the late 1950s and 60s, how they needed to somehow or another battle what they called the liberal left leaning of national politics, right? So that you know, let me put this in context. 1960, John F. Kennedy won the popular vote by the narrowest of margins against, wait for it, some of y'all know, Richard Nixon. And interestingly enough, Richard Nixon was probably the more liberal of the two. If we want to talk about policies, that's arguable. I know I'm throwing a monkey wrench in this conversation. But if you want to talk about who was more about what we needed to do about popular, what we call mainstream progressive causes and issues, probably Richard Nixon was probably a little more on the left side than the right side of John Kennedy. But anyway, Kennedy wins the popular vote, wins the presidency in 1960, and then begins to have conversations that were very interesting. At the same time, Martin King and others were leading the civil rights movement, leading us into a period of time of civil and social unrest. And while that was being prosecuted, there was groups of people in think tanks, in very conservative universities and colleges, beginning to think through how can we gain and recover power. Again, I want to also have you remember historically the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and into the 70s, Congress was dominated by the Democratic Party. What do you have to say about that, Katherine?
You're absolutely right. Listen, you're right on. I mean, they really studied the successes of the left. This is a group, they called themselves a new right. They felt like, they studied the successes of the left, and they realized that they were sort of losing the culture wars, I suppose. And they, again, felt the Republican Party was going in the wrong direction. It was too liberal. Pardon me. And they also, but one of the things they realized that the left had that they didn't have was religion. The left, Protestant religion was had become quite moderate. If you think about Niebuhr and some of the other figures who were sort of dominant or rising in that time and who had become very popular. Let's not forget that Jimmy Carter was evangelical Christian and was also very politically progressive and anchored his commitment to social justice issues and care for the poor in his faith, as many others did. And they saw this sort of as an abomination. So they cultivated what they called electronic ministers, people like D. James Kennedy and Robeson and Jerry Falwell, and sort of used these folks to spread their message, to get everybody on the same page, and try to kind of mount a kind of hyper-conservative counter-revolution. And over time, they really succeeded. I mean, they've invested for decades. You mentioned earlier Ralph Reed. He's one of the most seasoned and I would say astute strategists of the religious right. First, he was with Christian Coalition. Today, he's the Faith and Freedom Coalition. And he he and many others have invested for decades in all of the features of modern political campaigns. So when I think about the religious right today, or Christian nationalism, as I often describe it, to make clear that it's, number one, a form of religious nationalism like any other, and also that it's a political movement, not a stance in the culture wars. I think about the fact that they've, the strength of the movement is in its dense organizational infrastructure that has been built up over decades. And it consists of networking organizations like the Council for National Policy that get leaders of various factions on the same page. It consists of right-wing policy groups like the Family Research Council and Focus on the Family, and Heritage, legal advocacy organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Federalist Society, which plays an enormous role in grooming and promoting justices with a correct ideological positioning for the Supreme Court and lower courts. Very sophisticated data initiatives that use targeted voter information in order to turn out the vote, a vast right-wing messaging sphere, legislative initiatives, leadership training initiatives like the Leadership Council, which trains many of the sort of very political preachers and also the movement's allies. And so they all work together, on a kind of common political vision. And the movement is not, a lot of people characterize this as an evangelical movement. Well, it includes many white evangelicals, but it excludes some white evangelicals as well. 1 in 5 white evangelicals, for instance, voted for Trump. 4 in 5 voted for Trump, 1 in 5 did not. And it also includes representatives of a variety of both Protestant and non-Protestant forms of religion. So the movement would be nowhere without the involvement of a leadership cadre, small leadership cadre of sort of ultra-conservative Catholics. The sort of Catholic vote, broadly speaking, as you know, is pretty evenly divided around the political spectrum. But if you look at folks like Leonard Leo or Kristen Hawkins of Students United for Life, they play a very important role in the movement. And the movement even drives support from some individuals and groups that don't identify as Christian at all. What really unites them is not any sort of theological points so much as a common political vision. And this, it's a leadership-driven movement, and they're after, I would say, like 3 things, right? Number 1, power for themselves and their political allies, right? Number 2, access to funding, public funding to a large degree, I think to an unappreciated degree. This is a movement that's trying to get the government to fund their initiatives. And number 3, policies that privilege people with a sort of correct ideology and correct religious viewpoints. And policies that also sort of direct contempt toward those who are different. So, religious nationalism all over the world, it divides people. It doesn't unite people, right? It divides people in order to, in order to mask its own failures. I mean, look at somebody like Vladimir Putin, who has used religious nationalism in his own country to sort of distract and sort of all this anti-gay stuff that he's doing, anti-gay laws and stuff. I mean, his Russian society is full of problems. But if you get people worried about the gays, maybe they won't pay attention to the fact that people don't have a secure economic foundations and can't get the best things that they want for their children. And the religious right likes to claim to be standing for the American family, but the politicians with whom they're allied are promoting economic policies that are making it so much harder for so many American families to succeed.
Yeah. So let's just pause right there. I want to come back to that point and talk a little bit about how we're here in New England, and Katherine, and in Connecticut, and I would dare say it would be thought of New England that we wouldn't be really, these white nationalists, I won't call them that, these religious nationalists We don't have many of them here. We're a bit unaffected by this. We're thinking. We think. We're liberal sorts. Connecticut is viewed as a fairly blue state. That you'd be in error if you thought that. But Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Rhode Island. We're just a little bit of cut above this, and I ask folk who begin to espouse or begin to infer that we're somehow not the yahoos and or the hillbillies of middle America, right? I say to them, then who was Jonathan Edwards? Who George Whitfield and others? Sermons delivered like sinners in the hands of an angry God. One of Jonathan Edwards' most famous sermons. We got a little bit of this that has happened in New England that set up historically the plight of what I would say incivility, while also they would tolerate that they were a diverse and of a liberal understanding of religion. They ascribe meaning to a light sitting on a hill. Manifest destiny comes out of this kind of New England Protestant Puritan ethic. These were Congregationalists. These were Presbyterians. These folk were Unitarian and Universalists. They were thinking folk. These were these frozen chosen who ascribed religious value to the very understanding of what was this experiment called democracy. And I would say also with Paul Griffin in his book, I have it here, Seeds of Racism. Paul was in school and got his doctorate. This was a part of his, in fact, dissertation. He makes the claim that racism has religion at its center. It has a religious framing, if you will. And I can make a case in teacher courts or 2 or 3 around this. What I want to, the reason I bring it up is to hit the pause button or at least pump the brakes a little bit. That this doesn't exist outside of where we are and where we live. This kind of religious, this power grab. Let me just tell you, might I remind you, in order to vote here in New England, in the colonial world, in order to vote here, you had to own property, and be a white man, and a member of the church, right? That was our earliest form here in Connecticut. That was our earliest voting constituent, right? So don't get on the high and mighty too quick, because it would lead you to believe that somehow or another this is a modern invention, when in fact I would suggest this is just a play back to what we already have gone through and back to our roots here in this hemisphere and in North America. How do you respond to that?
Wow. I mean, it's such an interesting, if you look at the Second Great Awakening and the debates around the institution of slavery at the time and the role of religious authorities, it's such an interesting situation there. At the time, listen, in The Power Worshippers, I write about a dozen abolitionist theologians, including people like William Wilberforce and Charles Lowell, and Charles Grandison Finney and John Leland and many others. But at the time the preponderance of major American denominations had actually either made their peace with slavery or were actively promoting it. Leaders of the Southern Presbyterian Church said to eliminate it would either upset the established order, or they defended it outright. I'm thinking about people like Robert Louis Dabney, and folks like James Henley Thornwell of South Carolina, who sort of described the conflict of between the pro-slavery theologians and the abolitionist theologians. In this way, he said, the parties in this conflict are not merely abolitionists or slaveholders, they're atheists, socialists, communists on the one side, right? And he said, friends of order and regulated freedom of the other. And that was, so he's identifying order and regulated freedom with the practice of slaveholding. Now, Frederick Douglass noted that there were abolitionist theologians indeed, but he said they were distinctly disempowered minorities within their, within the larger church. He said, they had occupied humble pulpits. They didn't have a lot of money. Whereas he said the ministers of high standing, the $5,000 divines, that was a lot of money in those years, were on the side of enslavement. And when you talk about, the issues happening in the North, I think a lot of people don't remember that many representatives of churches of the North were in agreement. I'm thinking about people like Reverend Wilbur Fisk. He was the Methodist president of Wesleyan University. Nathan Lord or Nathaniel Lord, I can't remember quite, don't have his name at the top of my, but he was associated with Dartmouth. Moses Stewart, who was a top scholar in Andover in Massachusetts. They too agreed with these pro-slavery theologians that they could prove from the Bible that the institution of slavery was not sinful. And this is really unbelievable because it reflected more than just sort of the concentration of economic power in America. At a deeper level, is really part of a kind of counter-revolutionary response to the perceived liberalism or excesses of the American Revolution, which promised, listen, the American promise, however imperfectly it's been carried out, the idea that all people are created equal and have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is something that should apply to all people, regardless of race, gender, background, etc. And that represents the best of the American promise. And yet this was considered very threatening to all of these theologians who wanted to, conceive of the idea of, America as founded as a sort of conservative Christian republic with, laws based on the Bible, hierarchies rooted in their understanding of the Bible. But you can kind of see that, when you look at how religion is used to sort of emphasize or underscore these ideas about national identity, you have to conclude that, people are all over the map here. And I think that a lot of people think of today's religious right as a sort of theological movement. It's really not. It's about it's about power, control, domination. The idea of that a sort of right-thinking minority should rule over everybody else. A hostility to equality, a hostility to pluralism, and a hostility to democracy itself.
Yeah, see, that's what thank you, Catherine. This is the juxtaposition or the relationship I see with this kind of religious fervor, rooted in a Jonathan Edwards who was a major player and a critical role in the first Great Awakening. I would then say later you had some of these others who spawned what I would call the second Great Awakening of the 19th century. All right, that then led us into the conversation that you started to reference around slavery. Are you for or against? Again, making a religious claim on what was largely political and economics driven, right? If in fact you wanted to get rid of slavery, then we got to figure out how we build an economy without that, without free labor being at the center and core of it. Free labor, and of course, how we make the distinction between laborers, and these concentration camps, these labor concentration camps, not just plantations, these places where torture and intimidation, rape, and other heedless and hideous things occur. We have to do away with that to somehow formulate, a more perfect union, right? And yeah, so that was 200 years ago, right? We didn't we fight a civil war to fix all of that? And yet, right on the heels of that, we reinscribe a new way of thinking. Now we don't have enslavement anymore to deal with. Now we got Jim and Jane Crow. We go through a period of reconstruction, and then we just as we have done historically, we consolidate power, gets reinscribed in a different form, and by 1896, separate but equal. That then takes another 60 years to get down to Brown versus Board of Education. It's interesting to me that this what happened in 1979 for me, the juxtaposition of public education, right, inscribed with a racial frame, using religion as the authorship. The authority is the Bible. Man, y'all better wake up and smell the coffee here, right? That there's something going on that we can't play short, that we can't somehow dismiss as that's just the ravings of a few folk. That led to the backlash, or the right lash, I think, occurred coming out of the Obama second administration, his second term, into what happened with who I won't name, and the ridiculousness that now has public policy and law being really controlled by the judiciary, namely the Supreme Court. I don't have time to get into that, but when folk talk about elections don't matter, I would beg to differ. That at some core ways in this version of a kind of, I don't know, many of us would say we didn't really have a democracy until 1965, when everybody had the access to the vote. And now you want to tell me it's not beyond me with all the new legislation and law that's happening all across the United States right now happens to be in part around restricting the vote. Don't y'all see the connections? This is not just simple and small. It is huge and broad, and it's not a conspiracy theory alone. This is actual fact. Just like y'all want to use CRT as some mass conspiracy to make white people feel bad because of racism. Well, you feel bad on your own. It's still the truth. That people came to these shores without their permission. That's a truth. That's not a theory. And if you feel bad, and then get up and do something about it. Again, Catherine, I digress. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir.
No, it's great. It's absolutely great. When you mentioned voting, the other side, look, Ralph Reed said, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. Now, this is a minority. They were the Christian nationalists, and those who are favorable to their agenda represent a minority of our country, but they have disproportionate political power because they punch above their political weight, because they vote in disproportionate numbers. All the machinery of the movement, the policy groups, the messaging groups, the legal groups, the legislative initiatives, all that stuff, it all works in order to turn out the rank and file to vote, and to vote a certain way. Pastoral organizations, etc. So George Barna, he's a sort of very astute, I would say, pollster. He is part of the movement, but he does, he sort of identified the most devoted religious right supporters. He called them sage cons, spiritually active governance engaged conservatives. he said they only represent 10% of the country. These are people not just vote, but like get their friends and family out to vote and like 10% of the country. But in 2016, 91% turned out to vote, and 93% of those turned to vote for Trump. Now we have or I should say whose name we shall not say. So in in a country where 40 to 50% of people don't turn out to vote, it doesn't take a majority of the population to win elections, especially when you've got all the sort of race-based and gerrymandering and voter suppression that affects others, also people of color and others in Democratic-leaning districts, which they're trying to push through law and having some success in many states, and all the sort of bizarre voter suppression tactics, like laws where you can't bring somebody water, an old person water if they're standing in line, all that stuff. They don't want those of us who reject the politics of conquest and division to vote. And they also try to promote messages that are to people who are swing voters or people who they think they might be able to peel off and say, everybody's corrupt, don't vote, or vote third party for this other person, that kind of thing. So, voting really matters, and it matters not just in national election cycles, but in the midterms. We're coming up to the midterm elections. And frankly, our democracy itself hangs in the balance. We're at it's an all hands on deck moment, I think, and everybody needs to do their part.
Yeah. In our remaining moments, boy, this hour has gone by really fast. It's gone by. Oh my God! So I want to pivot right where you just left off. There is we're talking about national elections, and yes, it's very important who is president based on who gets to nominate Supreme Court justices and lower court justices. Absolutely correct. And right now, I think the danger of it is that whatever this so-called representative republic that we got, that's what I might call what we are operating on. Democracy is not really yet, but because it's too dominated by power and by money and by the interest of a few. We're not talking about the masses, e pluribus unum. No, we're really talking about a small slice of folk who have enough power and enough money to influence those who sit in the seats that we vote on election day, right? So that's my commentary. I'm just naming that for myself, and I'll own all of those words. I will also say, however, as we look toward where we are right now, where many of us, I don't know how we gave up ground here, that somehow I can't say the gospel is about feeding the poor. It's not. Somehow that's a bad word, and we can't get people to rally around prison reform. I want to actually abolish prisons because I think they don't do any good at all. But that's my bias. I'll leave that for a later episode, if you will. However, where the gospel is clear about some of the things that Jesus said, when you do this to the least of these, when you fed me when I was hungry, gave me some clothes when I was naked, came to visit me when I was in prison, the disciples said, Jesus, when were you hungry or naked or in prison? He said, when you do it to the least of these, the least of God's beloved, then you've done it to me. And yet we can't turn folks' attention to that part that is strongly based in a kind of religious core that all of our traditions, all of our many religions claim as a value for people who need support, who need help. I can't. It somehow doesn't make sense to me that you want to claim that every child needs. You're pro-life until they get born, and then you're anti-entitlements. You talking crazy, sister and brother. You're talking like you are foolish. I don't understand, and yet that narrative gets spun and respun in a certain kind of way. I'll say this too: the meanness and the outright just the barbaric treatment, I believe, this latest Supreme Court justice, and in fact, had to endure publicly to serve in an office as an associate Supreme Court justice. It's intolerable to me. When the other dude actually, there was a guy there a year or two or three ago who had done some really funky stuff, was not treated in that same way that this public servant, this black woman, in the way that she was spoken to and treated in the senatorial hearings there in that committee. You can't make wrong right, in my opinion, and you can't make right wrong. And what I say morality is, when we talk about what is moral, it's about a determination of what is right and what is wrong. And we don't, in many instances, we don't need people to teach us that. We know what that is. Adults and children know what that is. You touch that stove, you're going to get burned. That's wrong. I mean, it's self-interested in some ways, but it is also based in community. And for the life of me, I don't quite understand how we can go, but you can make that art somehow do something different with it. Could you speak to the latest efforts of these white nationalists or religious nationalists, as they have schemed? Now they are ready for us. They have schemed a new part of this work to sell these lies as if they're truths. Could you talk a little bit about that and what their implications are if they are not stopped?
Yeah, I think when we look at religious nationalism, it's pretty easy to see the harm to our politics. It divides the country. It sows division. They are very intent on misinforming large numbers of the public, sowing disinformation, which makes that large population immune to certain forms of information and disposed to believe other kinds of disinformation. They call sort of fact-based information fake news or the lying media. And this makes them a lot easier to control. If you can get people to believe a bunch of lies, you can get them to do pretty much anything you want, right? So that's the harm to our politics is really, really visible. It's also another part of the harm to our politics is that they sort of, when they cast themselves as engaged in an apocalyptic struggle between absolute good and absolute evil, demonic forces, which is what they often, democratic institutions or people who take a different political viewpoint are often in their forums that they share, like their conferences, cast as literally demonic and controlled by Satan. And that's very dehumanizing. I mean, this is in some ways the kind of language that precedes horrific it has preceded horrific historical events and genocides and things like that. When you literally demonize your political enemies, you don't see them as human beings anymore. I mean, it's really appalling. So the harm to our politics is really clear. But I think the harm to religion doesn't get quite enough attention. I think, by locking people who have certain sort of, they get people to vote their identity on these sort of culture war issues, and getting people to vote on a small number of non-negotiable positions, it allows these movement leaders to pursue their many agendas unchecked. And it also, the harm to religion has to do with, conflating the idea of religion itself with these non-negotiable positions. And that is a kind of heresy. I think most American Christians and most Americans of faith, broadly speaking, do not go along with the kind of politics of conquest and division. They see religion as having something to do with care for the soul, or loving the least of these, or loving your neighbor as yourself, or developing empathy for others, not targeting subgroups, disfavored subgroups for hate, not demonizing your political opponents, and not, targeting people with contempt, targeting those who are different with contempt. And certainly not, they don't think of religion as having to do with ramming unpopular legislative initiatives through gerrymandered state legislatures, but this is what the leadership really wants to do. They conflate the idea of religion itself with their politics, and that actually ends up alienating a lot of folks and turning a lot of people, certainly a lot of young people, away from religious experience.
Absolutely, it does. One of my friends and brothers, Dr. Cornel West, says it like this. He said, justice is what love looks like in public, as tenderness is what love looks like in private. And so, if God is love, then using Dr. West's lens, then what is justice? What does that mean in the context of the public discourse that is so hate-filled, right? Let's use the litmus battle lines of abortion and same-sex loving. Where is the love piece? Where is the justice angle? And in fact, I'm one of those religious folk and a religious leader that wants to reclaim religious language in this. If God is love, then that love has to represent injustice and just ordering and not favoring one small group of powerful, wealthy folk over others. It doesn't jive with me, and I call that anti-religious in a sense. That somehow Dr. King said it best. He said, we got these triplets of evil. He called it in his day, 1967. He talked about racism, materialism, and militarism. All right, this profiteering, vis-a-vis both the gain to get more and militarism. Fighting war after war after war. And good Lord, just can we just talk about the last 50, 60 years of warring up and through here? And we just got out of the longest engaged, military effort in this so-called country's history. And then all of a sudden there's a lot of, I call it wonk wonk, lot of buzzing around how we even got out of that. When in fact, I don't know how we got in it in the first place. The Vietnam, the World War II, Korean War, Vietnam, into Desert Storm, and ultimately, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. What were we fighting for? What were we engaged in? And then finally, for me, what we have going on right now with you named him earlier, with Russia and Putin and Ukraine, and it ain't got past me. These are some white folk having some disagreement. They fighting a war when there are wars and rumors of wars, if I can use some King James language, all over the world that is not getting the prime time visuals, right? What's going down in Latin America, and South America, and Central America, the friction that's happening all over the continent of Africa, what's happening in Southeast Asia. We're not talking about it here, but there's stuff going on across the world, and yet Russia and Ukraine dominate, and there's this, and then it's awful. I'm not claiming at all that there isn't something wrong happening. What I am suggesting, however, is that if we don't pay attention, folks, if we don't pay attention where these connections are related to religion and what I would call the agenda of the white nationalists, that we will lose what it is we thought we were fighting for. We will lose what we thought we have in part tried to build. We, in fact, may be on the losing side here if we don't pay attention as to how this works and get as smart and as sophisticated and well informed about what it is that we think is right. And that's my angle. That's why I wanted to have you on, Katherine. We're right down to the deadline. You got any final words for us? And I promise, if you think this was good, maybe we can invite it back.
It'd be great. I'd really love that. We have so much to talk about, so much we didn't get to. But, I appreciate what you're saying. Sort of a religious rhetoric, a sort of language, stories like the story of the Amalekites, the war on the Amalekites has been used, these sort of demonization of one's political enemies, or the idea that, God says kill all of them, have been used in some of the most tragic episodes in our history. If you think about, Northern Ireland, that rhetoric was used. It was used in Rwanda, so many other places. It's being used in Russia, this type of religious, this sort of rhetoric of genocide, calling the other side godless and evil and demonic and, little devils and things like that. That's what I saw a guy on Russian state TV describing Ukrainians in this way and saying, you good Orthodox soldiers, you need to finish them off. This is not remotely unique, this kind of dynamic, this exploitation of religion for the purposes of politics and power and domination. It's used all over the world. And I think it's, really want to thank you so much for having me here. One thing I just want to say before I go is, I'm seeing there are things that encourage me. I see there's much more awareness these days of what we're really facing, the stakes of what we're facing. I think that, 7 or 8 years ago, a lot of folks weren't really aware of this exploitation of religious nationalism for political gain by this, particular group, anti-democratic, elite. And now I think a lot more people see that. And I see a lot more investment in voting rights and in all the features of democracy, of democratic political infrastructure than I did before. So that's encouraging. But I also think that it's a kind of, again, all hands on deck moment, and everybody has to do their part.
Katherine, thank you so very much engaging in this very, very important conversation. There are some facets in here in your book that I want to make sure we spend some more time on. Listen, everybody, pick this book up. This book for me has been a game changer in having the conversations that I think we need to have as it relates to white nationalism and religious nationalism, religion playing its part in this idea of how do we get power and hold on to power, the power worshipers. And I love the book because of the flag. We always attach it power to this the symbolisms. And that's how you can tell it's got a religion. We stand and put our hands over our hearts, and all of a sudden we sing this national anthem that if you sang the third verse of that national anthem, it might change your thought processes about what Francis Scott Key was actually talking about. I'm just saying. Right? So folks, thank you all very much for taking out your time listening this last hour. Help me thank again Katherine Stewart, who I think is a brave soul to enter into these waters, to have these kinds of conversations and to do a little bit of truth telling about the way in which religion is helping to shape and form our country in a way that I think is dangerous and may be foreboding for what kind of country the United States of America ends up being in these next few moments in the near future. So thank you again. We'll be back at you maybe to talk a little bit more about this stuff right here, but for sure to have some more relevant conversations. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Katherine, for being with us. Peace, you all. We'll see you again.
Thank you, Bishop Selders.